When a ruthless gang targets a quiet black business owner, thinking he's an easy mark, they quickly learn they've messed with the wrong man. An ex-Special Forces operative fights back to protect his store and his community. But as the battle intensifies, he uncovers a shocking conspiracy led by a powerful developer bent on destroying everything his neighborhood stands for. Can one man rally his community and take down a corrupt empire before it's too late? The early evening sun cast long shadows over the streets of Riverdale, a historically black neighborhood that had weathered decades of neglect and slow-burning gentrification. The sidewalks were worn but familiar, and the air carried the hum of community kids playing basketball at the nearby court, neighbors exchanging greetings, and small businesses bustling with life. On the corner of Pine and Prospect, nestled between a beauty salon and a barber shop, stood Brown's Market. The modest convenience store was a staple of the neighborhood, offering not just essentials but also a sense of safety and continuity. Its owner, Elijah Brown, leaned against the counter, his sharp eyes scanning the aisles as a group of teenagers laughed their way out the door, snacks in hand. Elijah was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, his calm demeanor masking a past that few knew about. Before Riverdale and the store, Elijah had served 15 years in the Special Forces, a decorated soldier whose precise instincts and unshakable resolve had carried him through missions no one else could handle. But those days were behind him now. He had traded combat zones for the quiet of Riverdale, pouring his savings into Brown's Market, a place where he could rebuild not just his life, but also his community. The store itself reflected Elijah's meticulous nature. Every item was perfectly arranged on its shelf, the aisles were spotless, and the locks and security cameras were state-of-the-art. But Brown's Market was more than a business, it was a sanctuary. It was the place where parents sent their kids with a couple of dollars to buy milk, where neighbors stopped by to chat and check in, and where Elijah quietly covered the tab for anyone who couldn't afford their groceries. Riverdale, though vibrant, was changing. Over the past year, a wave of redevelopment projects had swept through the area. Shiny new condos now towered over old brick apartment buildings, and boutique coffee shops and yoga studios had replaced family-owned businesses. Rumors had spread like wildfire. Local stores were being bought out or worse, forced out by developers looking to profit from the prime location. Elijah had heard the murmurs from his customers and neighbors. Owners of shops just a few blocks away spoke in hushed tones about mysterious groups showing up late at night, making veiled threats or offering insultingly low offers for their properties. Some had accepted, unable to risk the violence or financial strain, but others had disappeared under more questionable circumstances. Elijah wasn't one to act on hearsay, but the unease had been gnawing at him for weeks. It wasn't until earlier that week, when Mrs. Henderson, who owned the bakery next door, burst into the store, visibly shaken, that Elijah's instincts told him trouble was coming. "They came into my shop," Mrs. Henderson said, clutching her purse tightly. "A couple of guys. Said they were offering to buy me out, but the way they said it, it didn't feel like an offer." Elijah had tried to reassure her, promising to keep an eye out, but her words stuck with him. He had spent the past few nights reviewing the security footage from his cameras, watching for anything out of the ordinary. So far, nothing had happened yet. Elijah's day began early, often before the sun rose. He would unlock the steel-reinforced door to his store, meticulously check the inventory, and ensure everything was running smoothly. He had built this business from the ground up, and his pride in it was evident in every detail. That evening was no different. The shelves were stocked, the till balanced, and the store hummed with quiet activity. Elijah watched as a young mother struggled to keep her toddler from knocking over a rack of chips. He smiled, stepping out from behind the counter to help her straighten the display. "Thanks, Elijah," she said with a tired smile. "You're a lifesaver." "Just doing my part," Elijah replied, his tone warm but understated. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the crowd thinned. Elijah used the quiet moment to adjust the security camera feed behind the counter. He leaned forward, studying the monitors out of habit. Years of military training had honed his ability to spot anomalies, and even now he couldn't help but scan for threats. Outside, the neighborhood seemed peaceful. Teenagers hung out on the steps of a nearby building, their laughter echoing down the street. The faint sound of music played from an apartment window above. It was a rhythm Elijah loved, a reminder of why he had chosen this place to settle down. As he locked the front door briefly to count the register, Elijah couldn't shake the tension that lingered in the back of his mind. He knew better than to ignore his instincts. Something was coming. He could feel it. What Elijah didn't know was that, just a block away, a battered black SUV was idling at the curb. Inside were three men, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard. "Is this the place?" the driver asked, his voice low and sharp. "Yeah," another man replied, nodding toward the store. "Brown's Market. Easy target. Word is the guy who owns it is soft, won't put up a fight." The leader, a man with a scar running down the side of his face, chuckled darkly. "Good. Let's make this quick. Boss wants this place gone by the end of the month." When Elijah unlocked the door and resumed his place behind the counter, the streets were quieter than usual. The regulars had gone home, the streetlights casting a dim glow over the empty sidewalks. He glanced at the clock, 8:45 p.m., another 15 minutes, and he'd close for the night. But as the bell above the door jingled, Elijah's calm routine shattered. Three men stepped inside, their movements deliberate and predatory. The leader, Scarface, scanned the shelves with a look of disdain, while the stocky one began wandering down an aisle, his boots heavy on the tiled floor. The third man hung back by the door, his nervous eyes darting around the store. Elijah's instincts kicked in immediately. His hand hovered near the counter, inches from the silent alarm button. His posture remained relaxed, but his senses sharpened. These weren't customers, they were predators. "Nice place you got here," Scarface said, leaning on the counter. His tone was casual, but the menace in his voice was unmistakable. "Real nice. Bet it'd be even nicer with the right kind of protection." Elijah met his gaze evenly, his voice calm but firm. "We don't need protection. We're doing just fine." Scarface's smirk widened, but there was no humor in it. "See, that's the thing about guys like you. Always so proud. But pride's expensive, and from where I'm standing, it looks like you can't afford it." Elijah didn't flinch. He'd seen this play before, different faces, different tactics, but the same game. He didn't need to ask what was coming next. The storm was already here. The tension inside Brown's Market was thick enough to cut with a knife. Elijah remained rooted behind the counter, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside him. He had faced far worse than these three men in his military career. But this wasn't a battlefield, it was his store, his community, and he wasn't about to let anyone tear it down. Scarface leaned in closer, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the counter. His eyes scanned Elijah, searching for any sign of fear or hesitation. "Let me lay it out for you," he said, his voice dripping with false congeniality. "We're offering you a way to make your life easier. A little fee, a small cut of your earnings, and we make sure nothing happens to this nice little store of yours." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Nothing's going to happen to my store." The smirk on Scarface's lips faltered for just a moment before he covered it with a laugh. "You hear that, boys?" he called out, turning to his accomplices. "This guy thinks he's untouchable." The stocky man, Reggie, had been idly examining a box of cereal, flipping it over in his hands as if he were considering buying it. At Scarface's words, he chuckled and tossed the box onto the floor with a loud crash. "Bet this stuff's worth more than the whole store," Reggie sneered. "Guess we'll find out how easy it breaks." Elijah's gaze shifted slightly to Reggie, taking in his stance, his movements, the way his hand hovered just a little too close to the edge of his jacket. A knife, Elijah guessed, though the man hadn't drawn it yet. Scarface, meanwhile, was still leaning against the counter, watching Elijah like a hawk circling its prey. The third man, Troy, lingered near the door, his nervous energy making him fidget with the zipper on his hoodie. Elijah's instincts screamed at him to act, but he forced himself to stay calm. He didn't want to escalate the situation, not yet. "Pick it up," Elijah said, his voice low but firm. Reggie blinked, clearly surprised by the command. "What?" "The box," Elijah said, nodding toward the fallen cereal. "Pick it up." Reggie laughed, a loud, grating sound that echoed in the small store. "Oh, I don't think so, old man. That's your job, isn't it? Cleaning up after guys like me." The insult hung in the air, but Elijah didn't rise to it. Instead, he straightened slightly, his hands resting flat on the counter. "You've made your point," he said evenly. "Now get out." Scarface's smile widened again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We're not done talking yet," he said, motioning toward Reggie. "Why don't you show him what happens when people don't listen?" Reggie grinned and reached for a jar of pasta sauce on the nearest shelf. He lifted it high above his head, pretending to inspect it, then let it drop. The glass shattered on impact, red sauce splattering across the floor like blood. The sound seemed to echo in the silence that followed. "You're cleaning that up," Elijah said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Reggie took a step forward, his boots crunching on the broken glass. "Oh, I don't think so, old man," he said, his grin widening. "But you can clean it up. Isn't that what you're here for?" Troy shifted uneasily by the door, his eyes darting between Reggie and Scarface. "Hey, maybe we should chill out," Troy muttered. "This guy doesn't look like he's gonna roll over." "Shut up, Troy," Scarface snapped, his tone sharp enough to make the younger man flinch. "This guy needs to learn how things work around here." Elijah tilted his head slightly, his calm gaze locked on Scarface. "This isn't how things work around here," he said. "And you're not doing anyone any favors." Scarface's expression hardened. "You've got a smart mouth for someone who doesn't have a clue what he's dealing with." Reggie stepped closer to the counter, crossing his arms and towering over Elijah. "You think you're tough?" Standing there all calm, like you're not outnumbered. "Let's see how tough you are." Elijah's eyes flicked to Reggie, then back to Scarface. "You don't want to do this," he said quietly, his voice steady. Scarface raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Oh, I think we do." Reggie reached for Elijah, his hand curling into a fist. The movement was slow, sloppy, even but Elijah didn't wait. In a blur of motion, he grabbed Reggie's wrist, twisted it sharply, and stepped around the counter. Reggie let out a howl of pain as Elijah's knee connected with his midsection, sending him sprawling onto the floor. The store erupted into chaos. Scarface lunged at Elijah, but Elijah sidestepped smoothly, deflecting the man's momentum and slamming him into a shelf. Cans and boxes clattered to the floor as Scarface stumbled, momentarily disoriented. Troy hesitated by the door, his hand hovering near his pocket. "Hey man, we don't have to do this," he stammered, his voice rising in panic. Elijah didn't respond. He was already turning back to Scarface, who had recovered enough to draw a knife from his jacket. The blade gleamed under the fluorescent lights as Scarface advanced, his movements more calculated now. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Scarface snarled, the knife held steady in his hand. "This ain't the movies, old man." Elijah's gaze never wavered. "Drop the knife," he said, his voice cold and commanding. Scarface lunged, the knife slicing through the air in a wide arc. But Elijah was faster. He sidestepped the attack, grabbing Scarface's wrist and slamming it against the counter. The knife clattered to the floor, and Elijah delivered a sharp elbow to Scarface's jaw, sending him crashing to the ground. Troy, wide-eyed and trembling, bolted for the door, his sneakers squeaking on the tile. "I'm out, man," he shouted, disappearing into the night. Reggie groaned from the floor, clutching his ribs, while Scarface struggled to push himself upright. Elijah stood over them, his breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "You've made your point," Elijah said, his tone sharp and unyielding. "If you come back here, it'll be worse for you." Scarface glared up at him, his face twisted with rage. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You don't know who you're messing with." "I know exactly who I'm messing with," Elijah replied. "Now get out." Reggie helped Scarface to his feet, and the two men staggered toward the door. Broken glass crunched under their boots as they left, their threats lingering in the air like smoke. Elijah waited until the door closed behind them before he allowed himself a deep breath. His ribs ached from where Reggie had landed a glancing blow, but he ignored the pain. He grabbed a broom from the back room and began sweeping up the shattered glass and spilled sauce, his movements calm and methodical. Outside, the streets were quiet again, but Elijah knew this wasn't over. Men like Scarface didn't just walk away. They'd be back, and next time, they wouldn't come empty-handed. Elijah straightened, his gaze flicking to the security camera feed behind the counter. He rewound the footage to the moment the men had entered the store, watching their movements with the precision of a soldier assessing the battlefield. He knew what was coming, and he wasn't afraid. This wasn't just a fight for his store, it was a fight for everything Riverdale stood for. Elijah had faced worse odds before, and he'd come out on top. But this time he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for his community. The silence in Brown's Market was unsettling after the confrontation. Elijah stood in the middle of the store, staring at the mess left behind shattered glass, spilled pasta sauce, and toppled shelves. He had fought his share of battles, but this one hit differently. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight to protect everything his community had built. Elijah exhaled slowly, his mind already working through his next steps. He wasn't naive. He knew Scarface and his crew weren't the end of the problem, they were just the beginning. Men like them didn't act alone. Someone was pulling the strings, and Elijah needed to find out who. The next morning, as Elijah was sweeping up the remnants of the fight, the bell above the door jingled. He looked up to see Detective Mia Carter walking in. Mia was a no-nonsense officer who had grown up in Riverdale. Her sharp eyes scanned the store, taking in the damage before settling on Elijah. "Looks like you had a rough night," Mia said, pulling out a notepad. "Something like that," Elijah replied, leaning on the broom. "Figured someone like you might show up eventually." Mia raised an eyebrow. Silent alarm went off. We were busy with another call, but I read the report. 3 men, threats, property damage, anything you want to add. Elijah shrugged, his tone calm but guarded. "They wanted money, control, thought they could intimidate me into selling." "And I take it you didn't just hand over the keys," Mia said, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "No," Elijah said simply. "I didn't." Mia jotted down a few notes, her expression turning serious. "These guys, they're not random thugs. I've seen their type before. They're usually muscle for someone bigger. Developers, gang leaders, whoever's paying." Elijah's jaw tightened. "You think they're working for someone?" Mia nodded. "I'd bet on it. The way things have been going in this neighborhood, too many businesses suddenly selling out. Too much violence to be a coincidence. Someone's clearing the board." Elijah leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "You got a name?" Mia hesitated, then sighed. "There's been talk about Vincent Mallory. He's a developer with deep pockets and no morals. Word is, he's been using intimidation tactics to get property owners to sell cheap. But we don't have enough to nail him, yet just rumors and scared witnesses." Elijah frowned. "Mallory, huh? What's he want with Riverdale?" Mia gestured toward the window, where shiny new condos loomed in the distance. "Same thing they all want. Land, profits, and control. This neighborhood's prime real estate now, and Mallory sees dollar signs." That night, after locking up the store, Elijah sat in his small back office. The desk was cluttered with invoices, receipts, and a dusty old laptop. He powered it on, the screen flickering to life, and inserted a flash drive. Years of military experience had left him with more than just combat skills. He knew how to gather intel, how to connect dots, and how to uncover the truth. He started with Mallory's name, digging through public records, news articles, and property transactions. It didn't take long to find a pattern. Mallory's company, Mallory Development Group, had purchased several properties in Riverdale over the past year, all of them at suspiciously low prices. Many of the sellers had reported vandalism, threats, or mysterious accidents before they sold. Elijah scribbled notes in a notebook, each piece of information forming a web of connections. But he needed more, something concrete that could tie Mallory to the violence. The next day, Elijah called a meeting at the local community center, a modest building that had been a cornerstone of Riverdale for decades. Word spread quickly, and by evening, a small group of business owners and neighbors had gathered in the center's main hall. Among them were Mrs. Henderson from the bakery, Mr. Patel from the hardware store, and Jamal, who ran a nearby barber shop. Elijah stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding but approachable. "Thank you for coming," he began, his deep voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "I know things have been hard lately. We've all felt the pressure, threats, violence, and people trying to push us out." Heads nodded, and murmurs of agreement filled the room. "I had a run-in with some of those guys last night," Elijah continued. "They made it clear they're not just after my store. They're after all of us. And I found out why." He held up his notebook, showing the group his findings. "There's a man named Vincent Mallory. He's a developer who wants this neighborhood. and he's willing to use people like Scarface and his crew to get it. The room erupted in whispers and gasps. Mrs. Henderson wrung her hands nervously. But what can we do? They've got money, lawyers, and muscle. We're just us. Elijah's gaze swept across the room, his expression resolute. We're more than that. This neighborhood is our home, and we've been through worse than Mallory. If we stand together, we can fight back. But we have to be smart. Jamal crossed his arms, his voice skeptical. Smart how? They're not going to stop just because we say no. Elijah nodded. No, they won't. But we can gather evidence. We can document everything, every threat, every act of vandalism, every shady deal. We take it to the police, the press, whoever will listen. And if they try to come after us, we make it clear they're not just dealing with one person, they're dealing with all of us. The room fell silent as the weight of Elijah's words sank in. Slowly, Mrs. Henderson raised her hand. I'll do it. I'll document everything. One by one, others began to nod. Elijah felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just his fight anymore, it was theirs. Later that night, as Elijah walked back to his store, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The streets were quieter than usual, the streetlights casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. As he reached the corner, the low rumble of an engine made him pause. A black SUV rolled slowly past, its windows tinted. Elijah's eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively reaching for the tactical flashlight he kept in his jacket pocket. The SUV stopped at the end of the block, its brake lights glowing like red eyes in the darkness. For a moment it lingered, and then it sped off into the night. Elijah exhaled, his grip on the flashlight tightening. The message was clear, Mallory's people were watching. But Elijah wasn't afraid. He had faced worse, and he wasn't about to back down. He stepped into the store, locking the door behind him. The fight was just beginning, but Elijah knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't be fighting it alone. The days following the meeting at the community center were tense. Elijah doubled down on preparations, knowing it was only a matter of time before Scarface and his crew made their next move. He reinforced the locks on the store, checked the security cameras twice a day, and installed an extra alarm system. But it wasn't just about protecting Brown's Market anymore, this was about keeping the entire community safe. Word of Elijah's efforts spread quickly. Business owners began to implement his advice, installing cameras, locking up earlier, and reporting any suspicious activity. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was late one Friday night when the retaliation finally came. Elijah had just closed the store and was sitting in his office, reviewing the latest footage from the security cameras. The streets outside were quiet, save for the occasional sound of laughter from a passing group of teenagers. Then, the unmistakable roar of an engine cut through the stillness. Elijah's eyes flicked to the monitor, where a black SUV pulled up in front of the store. 3 figures stepped out, and Elijah's jaw tightened. Scarface, Reggie, and Troy were back, and they weren't alone. 2 more men emerged from the vehicle, one carrying a crowbar and the other holding a baseball bat. Elijah's pulse quickened, but his expression remained calm. He reached for his phone and pressed a single button on the screen, activating the silent alarm he had installed after the last encounter. The signal would alert Detective Mia Carter, who had stationed a patrol car a few blocks away in anticipation of this very moment. As the men approached the storefront, Elijah watched them on the monitor. Scarface motioned to the others, his voice faint but audible through the external microphone. Smash it up. Make sure he knows we're serious. Reggie nodded, raising the crowbar, but before he could strike, Elijah stepped out of the office and into the store, his presence commanding as he flipped on the interior lights. Looking for something? Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. Scarface froze for a moment before a slow, sinister grin spread across his face. We told you we'd be back, old man. You should have taken the deal when you had the chance. I'm not interested in your deal, Elijah replied, his gaze steady. But if you've got something to say, now's the time. Otherwise, I suggest you turn around and walk away. Reggie sneered. Or what? You gonna take all 5 of us on by yourself? Elijah didn't respond. He didn't need to. His calm, unflinching demeanor was enough to make even Troy glance nervously at the others. Scarface laughed, though there was an edge of uncertainty in his tone. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't save you this time. Without warning, Scarface lunged at Elijah, throwing a wild punch. Elijah sidestepped smoothly, grabbing Scarface's wrist and twisting it behind his back. Scarface let out a yell of pain as Elijah shoved him toward the counter. The chaos erupted instantly. Reggie swung the crowbar, but Elijah ducked, the metal bar smashing into a display shelf instead. As cans and boxes tumbled to the floor, Elijah used the moment of distraction to deliver a sharp elbow to Reggie's ribs, knocking him back. Troy hesitated, glancing between his crew and Elijah. "Guys, maybe we should." "Shut up and grab something." Scarface barked, his voice strained as he struggled to regain his footing. One of the new guys, the man with the baseball bat, charged at Elijah. This time, Elijah didn't wait. He moved forward, closing the distance before the man could swing. Grabbing the bat with both hands, Elijah wrenched it free and used the handle to deliver a sharp strike to the man's leg. The attacker crumpled to the floor, clutching his knee and groaning in pain. Troy, clearly panicking, dropped the wrench he had been holding and bolted for the door. "I'm out, man. This isn't worth it." Just as Reggie and Scarface regrouped, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Red and blue lights flashed through the store's front windows, and the gang froze. "Cops?" Reggie hissed, his eyes wide. Elijah stepped back, breathing hard but still composed. "I told you to walk away. You didn't listen." The front door burst open, and Detective Mia Carter entered with her weapon drawn, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. "Drop your weapons and get on the ground. Now." Scarface cursed under his breath but complied, raising his hands as he dropped the knife he had drawn moments earlier. Reggie and the others followed suit, their bravado replaced with sullen resignation. As the officers moved in to cuff the gang, Mia holstered her weapon and turned to Elijah. "You okay?" Elijah nodded, his breathing steady. "I'm fine. Thanks for getting here so fast." Mia smirked. "Told you we'd be ready." With Scarface and his crew in custody, Mia and her team began interrogating them back at the station. It didn't take long for cracks to form in their loyalty. Reggie, bruised and visibly shaken, was the first to talk. "It wasn't our idea," he admitted, his voice low. "We were just following orders." "Whose orders?" Mia pressed. Reggie hesitated, glancing at the mirror on the wall. "Vincent Mallory," he said finally. "He's the one paying us. Told us to scare people, make them sell. Said it was business." Mia's jaw tightened as she exchanged a glance with her partner. They had suspected Mallory's involvement, but now they had a direct link. "What else?" Mia asked. "What's his next move?" Reggie swallowed hard. "The community center," he said quietly. "He wants it gone. Told us to make it look like an accident." When Mia shared the intel with Elijah, his expression darkened. The community center was the heart of Riverdale. Losing it would be a devastating blow not just to the neighborhood, but to everything it stood for. "We can't let that happen," Elijah said firmly. "We won't," Mia replied. "But we need proof, something solid to tie Mallory to this plan." Elijah nodded, his mind already racing. "I'll get it. But if Mallory's making his move, we need to be ready." The next few days were a blur of preparation. Elijah coordinated with the community, ensuring the center was monitored around the clock. Volunteers set up cameras and patrolled the area in shifts. Mia worked behind the scenes, securing a warrant and gathering evidence to build the case against Mallory. But Elijah wasn't content to wait. He knew Mallory would try to cover his tracks, and the only way to stop him was to strike first. The air in Riverdale was thick with anticipation. The neighborhood buzzed with quiet determination as word spread of Vincent Mallory's plot to destroy the community center. For Elijah, the fight had reached its boiling point. He had spent days preparing with Detective Mia Carter and his neighbors, but the time for planning was over. The time for action had come. It was a cold, clear night when Elijah arrived at the Riverdale Community Center. The center stood as a beacon of hope in the neighborhood, a place where children learned, neighbors gathered, and memories were made. Mallory's plan to demolish it wasn't just an attack on a building, it was an attack on the soul of Riverdale. Elijah parked a block away, his dark clothing blending into the shadows. He carried a tactical bag slung over his shoulder, filled with tools he hoped he wouldn't have to use. The surveillance cameras installed by the community had already given him an advantage. The gang Mallory had hired was inside the center, setting up what looked like fire-starting materials. Mia's voice crackled through the earpiece Elijah wore. "We've got eyes on the building. Backup is standing by, but we need confirmation Mallory's directly tied to this." Elijah pressed a finger to his earpiece. "Understood. I'm going in." "Elijah," Mia's tone was sharp but not unkind. "Be careful. We can't nail Mallory if you don't make it out of there." "Don't worry," Elijah replied, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "I've done this before." Elijah slipped through a side entrance that had been left unlocked, moving silently down the dimly lit hallway. His boots made barely a sound on the polished floor as he approached the main assembly room. He paused at the door, listening. Inside, he could hear the men talking. "Mallory wants this done tonight," one voice said, rough and impatient. "No screw-ups." "How long is this going to take?" Another voice complained. "This place gives me the creeps." Elijah leaned forward, peeking through the crack in the door. 4 men were inside, their faces partially obscured by hoodies and caps. One of them was pouring accelerant onto a pile of furniture stacked in the middle of the room, while another unpacked a set of lighters and matches. The 4th man stood slightly apart from the group, speaking into his phone. Elijah recognized him immediately from his research, Craig Waller, one of Mallory's trusted fixers. "Yeah, we're almost done here," Waller said, his voice low but carrying an edge of irritation. "Tell Mallory he'll have his accident by morning." Elijah knew this was his moment. He moved quickly, entering the room before the men realized he was there. "You boys lost." Elijah's voice cut through the air like a whip. All 4 men turned, startled. Waller's phone slipped from his hand as he stared at Elijah, who stood tall and steady in the doorway, his presence commanding. "Who the hell are you?" Waller demanded, his voice shaking slightly. Elijah didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, his sharp gaze sweeping over the scene. "This is a community center," he said evenly. "Not a place for cowards to play with matches." The man holding the accelerant sneered. "You've got a death wish, old man." Elijah's lips curled into a faint smile. "No, but you might." The man lunged, swinging the canister, but Elijah moved with the precision of years of training. He sidestepped the attack, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it sharply. The canister clattered to the floor as the man cried out in pain. Before anyone else could react, Elijah delivered a sharp elbow to his attacker's jaw, knocking him unconscious. The room erupted into chaos. Waller scrambled backward, shouting at the others, "Get him! Now!" The next man came at Elijah with a crowbar, swinging wildly. Elijah ducked, the metal bar whistling past his head, and retaliated with a powerful kick to the man's knee. The attacker crumpled, groaning in pain as Elijah disarmed him with a fluid motion. The 3rd man hesitated, clearly rethinking his life choices, but Waller barked at him. "What are you waiting for? Take him down." The man reluctantly charged, but Elijah was ready. He used the crowbar he had just confiscated, delivering a precise blow to the man's midsection before sweeping his legs out from under him. Within moments, 3 of the 4 men were incapacitated, groaning on the floor. Waller, now pale and visibly panicked, fumbled for something in his jacket, a knife. "Stay back," Waller shouted, waving the blade. "I'll kill you." Elijah didn't flinch. "You're not the first man to say that to me," he said coldly. "And you won't be the last." Waller lunged, but his movements were sloppy, driven by fear rather than skill. Elijah sidestepped easily, grabbing Waller's wrist and forcing him to drop the knife. With a sharp twist, he pinned Waller against the wall. "Mallory sent you," Elijah growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Didn't he?" Waller squirmed but couldn't break free. "You're dead, old man," he spat. "You think this changes anything? Mallory's untouchable." "Not anymore," Elijah said, slamming Waller against the wall one last time to knock him out. Elijah pressed his earpiece. "Mia, it's done." "They're down." Seconds later, the sound of sirens filled the night as police cars surrounded the building. Mia entered the room with her team, her eyes sweeping over the scene before landing on Elijah. "You just can't help yourself, can you?" she said, her tone equal parts exasperation and admiration. "Had to make sure they didn't light the place up," Elijah replied, stepping back as officers moved to cuff the unconscious men. Besides, I got what we needed. Mia raised an eyebrow. And what's that? Elijah pointed to Waller's dropped phone on the floor. Mallory's fixer was on a call with him. That phone's got everything: call logs, messages, proof of what they were planning. Mia nodded, a rare smile tugging at her lips. Good work. We'll get this to the DA. The next morning, Vincent Mallory was arrested at his downtown office. The evidence on Waller's phone, combined with testimony from the arrested men, left no room for Mallory to wriggle out of the charges. As he was led out of the building in handcuffs, reporters swarmed the scene, shouting questions. Mallory didn't respond, but his icy glare found Elijah, who stood across the street watching. This isn't over, Mallory snarled, his voice low enough that only Elijah could hear. Elijah met his gaze, unflinching. Yes, it is. In the weeks that followed, Mallory's empire crumbled. Properties he had acquired through intimidation were returned to their rightful owners, and restitution funds were established for the victims of his schemes. The community center remained untouched, its programs expanding with the influx of support. Elijah became a local hero, though he shrugged off the praise. For him, the fight had never been about recognition, it had been about protecting what mattered. One evening, as the sun set over Riverdale, Elijah stood outside Brown's Market, watching children play on the sidewalk. Mia pulled up in her unmarked car, stepping out with a grin. Still standing? She asked. Always, Elijah replied, his gaze steady. But this wasn't just me. The community made it happen. Mia nodded. Maybe. But they had you to lead them. Elijah didn't respond, but a faint smile crossed his lips. Riverdale was safe for now. And as long as he was there, it always would be. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.